June 1942. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, calm and blue, hiding beneath its vast surface the quiet approach of two powerful fleets. The air was tense with anticipation, as both sides prepared for a confrontation that would decide the future of the Pacific War. On one side sailed four mighty Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same deadly vessels that had brought destruction to Pearl Harbor. Their decks were crowded with bombers and fighters, the men aboard confident that their next strike would crush what remained of American naval power. On the other side, three American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, moved carefully across the ocean, their crews unaware of exactly when or where the enemy would appear, but determined to defend Midway at any cost. What the Japanese could not imagine was that the Americans already knew their plan. By breaking Japan's secret naval code, the U.S. had discovered the timing and direction of the attack. This single advantage turned the tide of fate before a single bomb was dropped. High above the ocean, American and Japanese pilots waited in their aircraft, ready for the order to launch. The roar of engines and the smell of fuel filled the decks as mechanics worked tirelessly to prepare the planes for battle. Soon the calm of the Pacific would be shattered by explosions, gunfire, and smoke. The Battle of Midway was about to begin, a fight that would decide who ruled the Pacific. Just 6 months earlier, in December 1941, Japan had stunned the world with a sudden strike on Pearl Harbor. Battleships were torn apart, smoke filled the harbor, and more than 2,000 American sailors lost their lives. The United States was shocked and enraged. Japan used the opportunity to expand rapidly across Asia and the Pacific, conquering Singapore, the Philippines, and Hong Kong, and even pushing its forces into the Indian Ocean. The Japanese Empire seemed unstoppable, its flag rising over new territories almost every week. Yet while Japan celebrated its victories, the United States quietly prepared for revenge. The three aircraft carriers that had been away from Pearl Harbor, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, became the backbone of America's new Pacific force. They were not many, but they represented the last hope of resistance against Japan's massive navy. For Japan, eliminating these carriers became the top priority. The Imperial Navy came up with a daring plan to lure the American carriers into a trap near a tiny island called Midway, located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. If they could destroy the American carriers there, Japan would control the Pacific completely. However, American intelligence had already uncovered the plan by decoding Japan's secret messages. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, quietly moved his three carriers east of Midway, waiting in ambush. His plan was simple. Let Japan believe the trap was set for America, while in reality the Americans would spring one of their own. Early on June 4, 1942, the ocean was dark and calm. On board the Japanese carrier Akagi, sailors and pilots moved quickly under the dim glow of red lamps. They rolled out their planes, checked engines, and armed bombs. The air was heavy with tension and the scent of fuel. At 4:30 a.m., the command to launch was given. The roar of engines filled the air as plane after plane lifted off into the night sky. From the four Japanese carriers, a total of 108 aircraft took flight. 0 fighters, D-3A dive bombers, and B-5N torpedo bombers. Their target, Midway Island, still asleep in the early morning darkness. Meanwhile, on Midway, the island's defenders were unaware of the storm approaching. The morning began quietly until radar screens lit up with multiple signals coming from the northwest. At 5:45 a.m., alarms screamed across the base. Pilots rushed to their aircraft and anti-aircraft crews loaded their guns. The small Marine fighter squadron on the island, made up of a few F-4F Wildcats and F-2A Buffaloes, took off to meet the incoming enemy. At around 6:20 a.m., the Japanese strike group appeared in the sky. Dozens of bombers broke formation, diving toward the island while Zero fighters circled above, protecting them from American planes. The first bombs exploded along the runway and near the barracks, throwing dirt and debris high into the air. The ground shook as the island came under full assault. American gunners fired desperately, their anti-aircraft shells bursting in black clouds around the attackers. But the Japanese pilots were skilled and well-trained. Within minutes, several American fighters were shot down, and the Japanese gained control of the skies. Bombs tore through fuel tanks, hangars, and the power plant, igniting massive fires. One explosion hit the ammunition depot, causing a chain reaction that destroyed the control tower. Despite the damage, some anti-aircraft batteries kept firing, refusing to give up. After 15 minutes of non-stop bombardment, the Japanese planes pulled away, returning to their carriers. Midway was burning. Smoke rose over the island. The runway was torn apart, and many American defenders lay dead or wounded. Yet the base was not completely destroyed. Some guns still worked, and a few aircraft could still take off. The defenders knew the battle was far from over. As soon as the Japanese attack ended, the Americans launched a desperate counterstrike. Every plane that could still fly was sent up. Pilots understood this might be their only chance to hit back. At 7:10 a.m., 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers flew low over the ocean, heading straight for the Japanese carriers. Behind them followed 4 B-26 Marauder bombers, each armed with torpedoes. The Japanese fleet opened fire with anti-aircraft guns, and 0 fighters dove down from above. 1 Avenger exploded in mid-air, and several others were hit, but the survivors kept flying, determined to release their torpedoes. The Japanese ships dodged every attack with quick, precise turns. 1 burning B-26, almost out of control, barely missed crashing into the carrier Akagi before plunging into the sea. Only 1 Avenger and 2 B-26s managed to return to Midway, all damaged beyond repair. At 7:45 a.m., another group of Marine dive bombers led by Major Lofton Henderson arrived to attack. Their planes were older and slower, a mix of SBD Dauntless and SB-2U Vindicator bombers. Lacking proper training, many pilots used shallow dives instead of steep attack angles, making them easy targets. Japanese Zeros swooped in, shooting down several planes. Major Henderson's Dauntless was hit and crashed into the sea. The remaining bombers released their bombs, but none found their mark. Only near misses splashed around the carriers. A few planes limped back to Midway, riddled with bullet holes. By now, 2 American attacks had been destroyed. The sky over the ocean fell silent again, filled only with drifting smoke and scattered debris. The Japanese fleet had easily survived, losing only a few fighters while the Americans suffered terrible losses. At 8:10 a.m., a formation of B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers appeared high above the Japanese ships, dropping bombs from 6,000 meters. The long fall gave the ships time to move, and all the bombs missed, exploding harmlessly in the water. Huge columns of spray rose around the carriers, but none were hit. At 8:30 a.m., another attack came. 11 SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers from Midway targeted the battleship Haruna. They flew slowly into heavy fire, released their bombs, and again missed. 2 planes were shot down. The Japanese fleet remained unscathed, while the Americans lost more brave men and machines. Yet despite these failures, the battle was far from decided. Beneath the smoke and chaos of the morning, the Americans still had one last card to play. Their carriers were hidden to the east, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The remaining planes released their bombs into the sea and turned back toward their base. During the morning hours of June 4th, all air raids launched from Midway Island ended in complete failure. Not a single American bomb or torpedo managed to hit the Japanese ships. Despite this, the continuous waves of attacks from the Americans, though doing no real damage, started to create mounting pressure on the Japanese command. On board the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo found himself in a very difficult position. At around 8:20 a.m., a report arrived from one of his scout planes claiming that American aircraft carriers had been spotted northeast of Midway. Almost at the same time, the commander leading the airstrike against Midway radioed back that the island's airfields were still functional and that another attack would be needed to fully disable them. Nagumo was stuck between 2 urgent choices, either to rearm his aircraft with bombs for a second strike on Midway, or to equip them with torpedoes in preparation for an attack against the American carrier fleet. As he debated which course to take, new waves of American bombers arrived from Midway, forcing his men to take defensive actions and disrupting the ongoing rearming operations. Aircraft that had returned from earlier missions now had to avoid enemy bombs, and were hurriedly moved around the deck for relaunch. Near misses from American bombs caused temporary chaos, forcing the deck crews to stop their work multiple times. Meanwhile, Japanese Zero pilots in the sky, having already fought for hours, were running dangerously low on both fuel and ammunition. These interruptions cost Nagumo valuable time, minutes that would soon decide the fate of Japan's carrier force. While the Japanese struggled with confusion and indecision, far to the northeast the American Navy was preparing to strike back. Using critical intelligence gathered from code breakers, Admiral Chester Nimitz had already placed U.S. carriers in a forward position near Midway, ready to ambush the Japanese. That morning, 2 carrier task forces under Vice Admiral Frank J. Fletcher and Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruance moved into their attack positions about 200 miles east of the Japanese fleet. The American force included 3 carriers, the Enterprise and Hornet of Task Force 16, and the Yorktown of Task Force 17. Once the scouts confirmed the enemy's position, orders to launch the attack were given. By 7 a.m., the flight decks of the U.S. carriers came alive with intense activity. Aircraft were being armed, fueled, and launched one after another into the bright morning sky. In total, more than 100 planes took off, including F-4F Wildcat fighters, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and TBD Devastator torpedo bombers. Their mission was clear: to find and destroy the Japanese carriers in a single decisive strike. At around 9:20 a.m., the 1st American Squadron made contact with the enemy. This was Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet, consisting of 15 Devastator bombers. Without any fighter escort to protect them, they bravely began their attack run immediately. Flying low over the waves, they approached the Japanese carriers from the southeast. As soon as they were spotted, more than 20 Japanese Zeros dove to intercept. The Devastators flew straight into a storm of bullets and flak. One by one, the slow-moving planes were torn apart in the air, but the pilots kept pushing forward toward their targets. Only a few of them managed to reach torpedo range and release their weapons at the carrier Soryu. The torpedoes splashed into the water, but none made contact. Within minutes, the entire squadron had been wiped out. 14 of the 15 aircraft were destroyed. Out of 30 men, 29 were killed. Only one young pilot survived, thrown from his aircraft before it sank. He clung to a small life raft, surrounded by oil and wreckage, as the massive battle continued overhead. Right after that, Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown also attacked the Japanese carriers, only to meet the same terrible fate. Nearly every plane was shot down before reaching their target, and once again not a single torpedo struck home. In less than an hour, 3 entire American torpedo squadrons had been nearly wiped out. Even though their attacks caused no physical damage, their bravery and sacrifice would prove to be one of the most important turning points of the entire battle. Their desperate assaults forced the Japanese ships to focus all their attention on defending themselves rather than preparing their own counterattack. More importantly, the Zeros had been drawn down to low altitudes to fight the torpedo bombers, leaving the skies above the fleet completely open. That was exactly where the American dive bombers were about to arrive. At that moment, a group of dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Squadron Commander Clarence McCluskey, had been struggling to locate the enemy. They reached the area where the Japanese carriers were expected to be, but saw only open sea. Fuel was running dangerously low, and McCluskey had to decide whether to turn back or keep searching a little longer. Spotting a single Japanese destroyer speeding southwest, he made a bold choice to follow it. That decision led his squadron directly to the heart of the Japanese carrier fleet. At about 10:20 a.m., as the Japanese fighters were still busy down low engaging the last American torpedo planes, 31 SBD Dauntless dive bombers appeared high above at 10,000 feet. McCluskey gave the signal to attack. The Dauntless bombers tipped forward and dove almost vertically toward their targets. The carrier Kaga was struck multiple times, one bomb hitting the hangar deck loaded with fueled aircraft ready for takeoff. Explosions ripped through the ship, engulfing it in fire within minutes. Simultaneously, the flagship Akagi took a direct hit that detonated in the hangar deck, turning it into a blazing inferno. Around the same time, dive bombers from the Yorktown struck the carrier Soryu, setting it ablaze as well. In just 5 or 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's most powerful carriers, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, were destroyed. Planes waiting to launch exploded where they stood, and the massive secondary blasts tore apart the ships from within. The flames consumed everything. Officers and crew either died instantly or were forced to jump into the sea. On nearby ships, Japanese sailors watched in disbelief as the heart of their fleet burned. When news reached Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, he refused to believe it at first, but the loss was undeniable. The core of Japan's carrier power, the same force that had struck Pearl Harbor and conquered much of the Pacific, was now gone. Meanwhile, the American dive bomber pilots looked back to see pillars of black smoke rising skyward. They regrouped quickly to save fuel and turned home. The few minutes of destruction they had caused completely changed the course of the Battle of Midway and, in truth, the entire Pacific War. On the last remaining Japanese carrier, Hiryu Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi wasted no time. By 10:40 a.m., he had organized an attack force consisting of 18 Aichi D-3A dive bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. Their target was the American carrier Yorktown. Yorktown had only recently been repaired after being damaged in the Coral Sea, and was now sailing alongside Enterprise and Hornet. Around noon, Yorktown's radar picked up the approaching enemy aircraft. Alarms rang throughout the ship as crew members rushed to battle stations. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, and the last available Wildcats took off to intercept the incoming attackers. In the air, the two forces clashed fiercely. Several Japanese bombers were shot down, but the rest pressed through the defensive fire and began their dives from over 10,000 feet. 3 bombs struck Yorktown directly, shaking the entire vessel. Fires broke out in multiple areas, and the ship briefly lost power and slowed down. Smoke filled the sky as the carrier listed to one side, yet the crew reacted swiftly. Damage control teams worked tirelessly to contain the fires and restore balance. Within an hour, Yorktown was back to near normal speed. From a distance, it looked almost unharmed, even though the battle around it still raged on. At about 1:30 in the afternoon, the Japanese carrier Hiryu sent out its second wave of attackers. 10 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers guarded by 6 Zero fighters. As the formation neared the battle area, the Japanese pilots were shocked to see what looked like a brand new American carrier still floating undamaged. They assumed this must be another ship because they had believed Yorktown was destroyed in their earlier strike. In reality, Yorktown's crew had worked furiously to patch up damage and restore power, making her appear almost untouched from above. Thinking they had discovered a fresh target, the Japanese pilots split their group into 2 wings and began circling around for a deadly pincer movement. The alarms aboard Yorktown sounded again, echoing across the decks as sailors rushed to their battle stations. Anti-aircraft guns opened up immediately, sending bursts of tracer fire into the sky while Wildcat fighters scrambled to meet the incoming threat. Several of the attacking planes were destroyed, but others broke through the defensive wall and closed in for their torpedo run. Torpedoes splashed into the sea from both directions, streaking toward the carrier. Within seconds, 2 of them struck Yorktown on her port side with tremendous explosions. The force of the blasts ripped huge holes in the hull and knocked out the engines, leaving the ship dead in the water. Seawater rushed into the damaged compartments and the carrier began listing heavily to one side. The crew knew the ship was in serious danger of sinking. As the Japanese planes withdrew, the sound of explosions faded, and for a moment, the vast Pacific grew eerily calm. Rescue ships quickly closed in to help the stricken Yorktown. The captain, realizing the extent of the damage, made the painful decision to abandon ship so that lives could be saved. Most of the sailors climbed down ropes or boarded lifeboats, while a smaller group of brave volunteers stayed behind to try to control flooding and fires. Against all odds, Yorktown did not sink that evening. Through the long night of June 4th, she remained afloat, badly wounded but refusing to die. Meanwhile, the Japanese pilots who had returned to Hiryu triumphantly reported that they had destroyed 2 American carriers. Their commanders believed the reports, thinking they had turned the tide of battle, but both attacks had struck only the same ship, Yorktown. Despite the optimism of his men, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu faced a grim reality. His ship was now the last operational Japanese carrier in the battle, and his remaining aircraft were far too few to match the Americans. Still, Yamaguchi's determination was unshaken. He prepared his pilots for one last desperate assault, ready to risk everything for Japan's honor. However, soon afterward, reconnaissance confirmed that at least 2 American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, were still fully active. The situation was hopeless. After receiving orders from Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had already shifted his flag from the burning Akagi to the cruiser Nagara, Yamaguchi was forced to cancel the attack. Nagumo had accepted that victory was impossible and commanded the fleet to retreat westward. Yamaguchi, though frustrated, prepared to defend Hiryu to the end, knowing it might be her final stand. Late that afternoon, American reconnaissance aircraft spotted Hiryu moving west, still attempting to escape. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, now leading the U.S. task force, did not hesitate. Around 5 p.m., 40 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet roared into the sky. The Japanese fleet prepared for their arrival, surrounding Hiryu with smokescreens, while 13 Zeros took up defensive positions overhead, and anti-aircraft guns filled the air with fire. Yet despite their efforts, the American pilots pressed on with courage and precision. From thousands of feet above, the Dauntless bombers dove almost vertically, each pilot picking his target and holding steady despite the deadly flak bursting around them. Several planes were shot down before reaching their mark, but enough survived to unleash devastation. 4 heavy bombs slammed into Hiryu, one plunging deep into her engine room, triggering massive explosions that tore through the interior. Flames erupted instantly and swept across the decks, feeding on the fuel and ammunition stored below. Within minutes, the once proud carrier was consumed by fire, her crew desperately trying to control the inferno but failing. On the bridge, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi stood calmly beside Captain Tomokazu Kaku. Both officers refused to leave their ship. As smoke and flames spread, Yamaguchi told his crew to abandon ship and save themselves. But he and Kaku stayed behind, choosing to share the fate of their carrier. By sunset, Hiryu was a burning skeleton drifting in the vast Pacific, her decks collapsing from the explosions below. Through the night, Japanese destroyers returned to rescue the surviving crew, pulling hundreds of wounded men from the sea. At dawn on June 5th, when it was clear that Hiryu could not be saved, Japanese destroyers fired torpedoes into her side to scuttle the ship and prevent it from falling into American hands. Slowly, the carrier slipped beneath the waves, taking with her Yamaguchi, Kaku, and many loyal sailors who had chosen to die beside their commanders. That same night, the remaining Japanese warships began retreating westward, abandoning their plan to seize Midway. Spruance decided not to chase them into the dark, knowing that submarines or long-range bombers from Wake Island could pose a deadly threat. He ordered his ships to conserve strength and resume the hunt in daylight. The next morning, June 5th, American reconnaissance planes fanned out over the surrounding ocean searching for stragglers. Most of the Japanese fleet had already escaped, but 2 heavy cruisers, Mogami and Mikuma, met disaster while trying to avoid a U.S. submarine. In their panic, the 2 massive ships collided, crumpling their bows and leaving them both heavily damaged. Mikuma fell behind, escorted only by a few destroyers, while Mogami, her stern crushed, limped along at low speed. By midday on June 6th, American scouts from Enterprise spotted the damaged ships. Spruance immediately launched dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet. The bombers found their targets easily. Mikuma took multiple direct hits that ripped open her decks and set off violent fires. Her fuel ignited, and soon she was engulfed in black smoke, sinking slowly beneath the waves. Mogami was also struck and set on fire, but her crew managed to keep her afloat, steering her toward the southwest. Realizing the dangers of pressing too far into Japanese-controlled waters, Spruance ordered the attacks halted and regrouped his forces to the east. On the morning of June 7th, while salvage teams worked tirelessly to save the crippled Yorktown, disaster struck again. The Japanese submarine I-168 managed to sneak through the protective destroyer screen and fired a spread of torpedoes. Several slammed into Yorktown, sealing her fate once and for all. The destroyer USS Hammond, tied alongside the carrier and providing power for repairs, was also hit and sank in minutes, taking many of her crew with her. The remaining sailors were rescued, and as dawn broke, Yorktown rolled onto her side and slowly slipped beneath the Pacific, marking the end of her brave service. After 4 days of relentless fighting, from June 4th to June 7th, 1942, the Battle of Midway came to an end. The once calm ocean was now covered in oil, debris, and the wreckage of ships and aircraft. Japan's losses were staggering. 4 of its prized carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with the heavy cruiser Mikuma, had been destroyed. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen were dead, including many of the skilled pilots who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a defeat so crushing that it would never recover its former power. The United States, though victorious, paid a heavy price. The carrier Yorktown was gone, the destroyer Hammond lost, and nearly 300 American servicemen had died. Yet the outcome of the battle changed everything. The victory at Midway lifted American morale, erased the humiliation of Pearl Harbor, and proved that Japan could be defeated. More importantly, it marked the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan was forced onto the defensive, while the U.S. seized the momentum, beginning a long campaign of counterattacks that would start with Guadalcanal only 2 months later. Midway became a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and strategy, a moment when ordinary pilots and sailors turned the tide of war across the endless blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean.